you wanted to share with our viewers when safety goes wrong. You can have all the precautions, but things can still happen with that. So do you want to retell your story?
Sure, yeah. So this is just the story of the worst safety fail that I have seen in all my years as a fire dancer. And it happened at a house party here in DC several years ago. We had basically set up a fire circle in the backyard of this communal burner household, and there was meant to be a single area that was a fuel have their fuel in the dumps and everything. A lot of people got stuff to share, which was totally awesome. But there was one person who had brought some fuel as well as a dipping bucket that he decided not to have in fueled up area with everybody else. And even worse than that, he A, didn't mark his container to tell anybody what it was, and B, didn't even let anybody know that he had fuel in his container. And what it was is like one of those plastic 5-gallon buckets with a paint can inside, and the paint can was full of 50/50, half white gas and half lamp oil. Now, at one point during the evening, one of the people who was traveling with, a young woman who's a teacher, went looking for the plastic bin for something that she brought with her that she couldn't find. And unfortunately, she decided to use a cigarette lighter to inside this bucket and to see what was inside of it, because it was fairly dark out. And it's that classic thing that they always tell you can happen with white gas, and that you always talk about in the fuel dump. It's like, have you ever seen it happen? Have you ever seen it happen? No, I've never seen it happen. This time it happened. The fumes were built up inside of the plaster bucket, the lighter caught them, and it set the paint can on fire.
There was a big explosion, right?
Oh yeah, well there was definitely a poof that everybody heard, and she was definitely quite dazed and a little disoriented. And we did have a person who's used to be in charge of safety there and everything. So as soon as he sees this, and bear in mind, this bucket is several feet away from the rest of the fuel dump, and it's in amongst people's stuff, and it's in amongst people too.
And there's people spinning fire at the same time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so the immediate concern was to try and get the bucket out of this heavily populated area and say further into the fire, towards the fire circle and everything, where it would A, be away from people, and B, be closer to the safeties and everything. So once that had happened and everything, they did try and put it out, I believe at first with a duvet, and it just burned straight through it, and then
straight through the duvet.
Yeah. Oh no, this is a pretty intense fire, because again, there was definitely a moment of panic where people were trying to figure out how to deal with this thing, and unfortunately, the bucket wound up getting kicked over at one point, and the fuel spilled out onto the ground and everything. And the thinking was, okay, it's going to be okay. The fuel's going to evaporate and everything because it's white gas, because people didn't know it was a 50/50 mix. And so what happened instead is that this is essentially napalm now. It's because the lamp oil sticks to everything. So rather than being a, unpleasant but contained fire, it became an uncontained and even more unpleasant fire. It wound up melting through the plastic bucket, so it just wound up being a puddle of molten plastic sitting there in the fire circle and everything. As I recall, eventually a fire extinguisher had to be acquired to put it out and everything. And
luckily, there was one there.
Yes, and even more luckily, nobody got hurt and nothing else got lit on fire. This was relatively close to a tree, which could have gone up. If the fire had gotten out of control and everything, it could have impacted the nearby house and everything. It's an interesting contrast, because there were a lot of things that we did right. There was a designated person in charge of safety there. There was the fuel dump that everybody was using and everybody needed to be careful of and everything. And it only takes, one or two things going wrong in that chain for something to go horrendously and uncontrollably wrong. Unfortunately, it was one of those situations where just that chain of things going wrong all happened. If this guy had marked his container so people knew what was inside of it, if this girl had used a flashlight instead of a cigarette lighter, if the bucket hadn't been kicked over, if they'd gotten fire extinguisher sooner, things like that. But in the grand scheme of things, it is both in my mind an example of how terribly things can go wrong, as well as how people can respond responsibly in times of crisis, because the person who's in charge did absolutely the best they could with the information that they had at that time. I firmly believe that. It was just that there was far too much that they didn't need. So.
And then the cops got called, and you can't spin fire there anymore.
Yep. So, fortunately and unfortunately, the ending to that story is not as sad as it could have been, but it nonetheless is not necessarily a happy ending.
Right, but it's a really great example of how fire safety is everyone's responsibility, because it only takes one person not following the standard protocols to things going out of control.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
My pleasure. Mm-hmm.